Welcome to the US Eagle Claw channel. The Ukrainian War changed definitions in many dictionaries. This war, which broke out in Eastern Europe in the 21st century, completely changed war strategies of the 19th and 20th centuries. Developing technologies, critical moves on the battlefield, and how helpless the old great powers are now have been seen by the whole world. Especially the destruction of Russian tanks, which are among the most powerful in the world, like a piece of paper during the siege of Kiev, showed us that it is necessary to abandon the old war habits completely and to come up with new war strategies. Another important lesson in the hot front line was that strategic superiority contributed much more to armies than weapon superiority. The Ukrainian army achieved the impossible with the limited opportunities in its arsenal, and achieved historical success against the Russian army, which is 20 times superior as a weapon, with its appropriate strategy and military genius. While many heroic soldiers and military genius commanders emerged in Ukraine, the bitter truths of the inflated and exaggerated military structure of the Russian army in the 30-year period after the Cold War were revealed. Russia dismissed many of its generals and senior officers during the Ukraine war. After each defeat, Russian President Vladimir Putin fired a Russian general and stepped aside. But on the other hand, the Ukrainian commanders are increasing their combat experience and are far ahead of the Russian generals in tactical terms. However, the detail that should not be overlooked here is that most of the Ukrainian generals grew up with the Russian school. Battles are a natural breeding ground for heroes. To see that, simply pass through any village in Ukraine. Each municipality contains monuments dedicated to Soviet soldiers who fought against the Third Reich during World War II. But Ukraine, a country that has existed for only 31 years, needs its own heroes today, and Kiev found them in the generals who led the country's defense against Russian invasion. Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar selected 4 people she said in September are ready to become Ukraine's own heroes. Maliar emphasized that there was heroism in all ranks of the army in the Great War of Liberation, but especially these 4 officers were on everyone's lips. These officers are Valery Zaluzhny, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrskyi, Commander of the Ukrainian Land Forces, Serhiy Shaptala, Chief of Staff, and Major General Andriy Kovalchuk, who led the counterattack on the southern front that resulted in the withdrawal of Moscow forces from Kherson. All 4 senior generals are credited with leading the defense of Kiev at the start of the invasion and the successful counter-punches that led to the Russian retreat. These people have studied and applied NATO principles, but the main factor that makes them military leaders is 8 years of experience in the Donbass. Even those who served as advisors in the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense when the officers were Soviets dressed in Ukrainian uniforms still exist. This situation also seems to have changed completely with a new generation trained by a combination of Western military forces and Soviet heritage and trained in the war in the Donbass. This generation has received extensive 8-year apprenticeships on the front lines, and that's something no other military in the world can say. These are the officers who had to create an armed force from scratch. They made decisions at all levels, from upgrading uniforms for war to getting food rations. While Ukraine had both Soviet technology and heavy military training of that period, it acquired NATO's modern and advanced war strategies and training in the last 8 years and made it unique by blending the war teachings of these 2 different poles on the hot front. As a footnote, I should mention that even in Soviet times, the US Army adopted the Special Ops teachings while forming the USSR Spetsnaz Special Forces, and for many years, it largely copied the US military teachings and blended them with Soviet culture and created today's Spetsnaz. At the moment, we see the Ukrainian Spetsnaz, or Special Operations Forces, behind every key operation and heavy blow to the Russian army in Ukraine. The point about the blended military training in the Ukrainian army that I have just mentioned is perhaps the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, or in other words, the Ukrainian Spetsnaz. We see today's perfect blend of Western and Soviet military teachings in Ukraine. Considering that Ukraine's military origins are based on Soviet military training, and the generals leading the Ukrainian operations are actually generals trained by the Russian Federation 30 years ago. The Russian Federation is heavily defeated by the generals it has trained with its own hands. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his statement that Ukraine is fighting for independence and survival. Ukraine's confrontation with an occupier who did not recognize its existence as a sovereign nation completely unified the population for the first time in 40 years. Social differences regarding the country's relationship with Russia have been largely forgotten since February 24th, when Vladimir Putin ordered the attack. But while the most nationalistic sections of Ukrainian voters still harbored doubts about Zelensky, the army unifying force mirrored a society that prided itself on resisting a superpower's onslaught. When Zelensky appointed Zaluzhny commander-in-chief of the armed forces in July 2021, the 49-year-old general had no doubt that a Russian invasion was imminent. Zelensky himself was skeptical of this threat until the day Putin launched his special military operation, despite warnings from US intelligence agencies. As Ukrainian media reported, the exchange of information between the Pentagon and Zaluzhny is now daily and direct. 2 months before Russian forces launched the invasion on February 24th, Zaluzhny was preparing his army when the moment came. The commander-in-chief was secretly deploying full regiments and installing artillery batteries and air defense systems in the north of the country, especially around Kyiv, without even providing many details to his own Ministry of Defense. Troop movements were carried out in a way that caused the enemy to believe they were still stationed at their base. This decision was decisive in the liberation of Ukraine. The appointment of Zaluzhny and Lieutenant General Shaptala was the death knell for Soviet military doctrine. The Ukrainian armed forces was deprived of much of its power and budget after the country's independence, but everything changed when Moscow illegally annexed Crimea in 2014 and backed a separatist uprising in the Donbas region. From that moment on, a process of rearmament and modernization based on NATO military models was initiated. The younger generation of officers, led by Zaluzhny and Shaptala, completed the transformation. The respect enjoyed by Ukraine's military commanders among people is immense. In September, Zaluzhny gave an interview in which he praised the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, in his opposite number, for example, unthinkable for a politician. I grew up with Russian military doctrine, and I still think that the science of warfare is entirely in Russia, said Zaluzhny. I learned from Gerasimov. I read everything he wrote. He is the smartest of men, and I had very high expectations of him. Savchuk interprets this as having two meanings. Ukrainian officers understand their enemies. They have shown that they are soldiers and command the armed forces, unlike Russian generals. Zaluzhny was trained by the Red Army. This knowledge of the enemy has been key and is something the Russian military has shown it lacks. Zaluzhny gave an example in an interview he conducted. Despite his numerical inferiority, he set a trap for the advancing Russian troops in Kiev, which was effective because his opponents did not know what they were up against. Months before the invasion, Zaluzhny had outlined the three main routes Russia would use to invade them from the north, via its territory and Belarus. Rather than engage the invader in the early stages of the invasion, he allowed them to advance to Kiev's first line of defense and then launched rapid attacks with small units behind them and in their supply chains. Moscow's troops discovered too late that the population was not on their side either. In other words, the Russian army had already given its tactics to the opponent with its own hands. Because a Ukrainian, who had as much command of Russia's moves as a Russian general, was leading the Ukrainian armed forces. Syrsky is Ukraine's most admired officer after Zaluzhny. He led the defense of Kyiv and together with Kovalchuk led the lightning counteroffensive on the Kharkiv front, which forced Russia to withdraw beyond the borders of Luhansk. The commander of the Ukrainian ground forces proved that his men knew how to attack as well as to defend. Syrsky's tactics were based on NATO doctrine as well as Gerasimov's own tactics. Unlike the Russian army, the Ukrainians prefer a less hierarchical structure where frontline commanders have the autonomy to act on their own initiative. He also deployed small divisions, usually no more than 12 men, to survey the enemy defenses to advance his troops, eventually causing the Russian lines to collapse. While individuality was seen as a weakness in armies, the flawless functioning of the command system in Ukraine gave them great advantages. From a strategic and operational point of view, face-to-face confrontations in large formations are a thing of the past, Gerasimov said in 2014, shortly before the outbreak of the Donbas conflict. Many of his tactics were used to the letter by Russian forces in Ukraine, but were also adopted by the Defense Army. One of the main points that made the difference here was that the Ukrainian armed forces knew the region much better than the Russian army. Where Zaluzhny's military preparations fell short was in the south. Within a few days, Russia invaded the Kherson region, cutting off access to most of the Black Sea coast and moving across the Dnieper River into Ukraine. Once launched in the autumn, the Ukrainian counter-offensive steadily progressed, forcing the Russians to withdraw to the eastern bank of the Dnieper. A hero of the Donbas War, where he participated in the liberation of Sloviansk and the siege of Luhansk airport, and led the 80th Airborne Brigade in 6 weeks of defense, despite numerous wounds, Kovalchuk was responsible for operations in the south. Zaluzhny was greeted like a hero in Kherson as Ukrainian troops recaptured the city. Ukraine has several contemporary national symbols. The generals leading the country's defense are preparing to become the founding heroes of the new Ukraine. Now it's time for new hero statues to rise in the cities of Ukraine. These great commanders more than deserve the honor to be given. Thanks for watching us.